it's not true that advantages in manpower and firepower always and everywhere result in decisive wins. And indeed, Russia's advantage in firepower is much narrower than it was.
Reprogramming 0.05% of the defense budget required over 40 briefings to Congress.
And you need to fail to innovate. That is so much of what it's going to take to be more Ukrainian in our own systems.
Trump's pivot to Putin. How will AI change warfare? What lessons can we learn from the battlefield in Ukraine? How is war changing? And what does the U.S. defense community need to do to adapt? To discuss, we have on Shashank Joshi, legendary defense editor at The Economist, on a generational run with his past few years of Ukraine coverage, and Mike Horowitz, currently a professor at Penn, who served as Biden's U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities in the Pentagon. And you can all thank him for having the foresight to not hire me, because otherwise we wouldn't have China Talk today. I'm glad we're on this timeline, even though there are plenty of other pieces of this timeline I'm not particularly happy about. One quick note, this episode was recorded February 26th, 2 days before Zelensky's disastrous press conference with J.D. Vance and Trump in the White House. Let's start with Shashank. You had a lot of fun on Twitter this week, it seems.
Yeah, as you can see, I was in a swimming pool with my children on holiday in the middle of England, and I didn't notice until 18 hours after the fact that the Vice President of the United States had been rage tweeting me over my intemperate tweets on the subject of Ukraine. I provoked him into this in much the same way that he believes Ukraine provoked the invasion by Russia.
What does it mean?
It means the vice president has far too much time on his hands, Jordan. This is a pretty significant debate, right? Fundamentally, this was about, is Ukraine fated to lose? And his contention is that Russian advantages in men and weapons, or firepower, I think, meant that Ukraine's going to lose no matter what assistance the United States provides. And my argument was, yes, look, Ukraine is not doing well. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I've written about this. It's made me pretty unpopular among many Ukrainians when I've written this. But it's not true that advantages in manpower and firepower always and everywhere result in decisive wins. And indeed, Russia's advantage in firepower is much narrower than it was. The artillery advantage is closed. Ukraine's use of strike drones has done fantastic things for their position at the tactical level. And on the manpower side, Russia is still losing somewhere in the region of 1,200, 1,300 men killed and wounded every single day. And while it can replenish those losses, it can't do that indefinitely. So I'm not saying Vance is completely wrong. I'm just saying he is exaggerating the case that Ukraine has already lost and that nothing can change this. And my great worry, this is driving the Trump administration into a dangerous, lopsided, inadequate deal that is going to be disastrous for Ukraine and disastrous for the continent where I live, Europe. And I'm worried profoundly about that at this stage.
Quantity generally sets the odds when we think about, what the winners and losers are likely to be in a war. And Russia has more and will probably always have more. But there are lots of examples in history of smaller armies, especially smaller armies that are better trained or have different concepts of operation, sort of different planning, emerging victorious. Most famously in the 20th century, maybe Israel's victory in 1967.
We have 3 years of data, right, Shashank? I mean, it's not like you're playing this exercise in 2021. You're doing this exercise in February of 2025. And by the way, Mr. Vice President, your government has a ton of the cards here to change those odds and change the sort of correlation of forces on the ground, which just makes the argument that this is a tautology so absurd coming from one of the people who is in a position to influence and, who has already voted for bills that did influence the course of this conflict.
I agree. I think wars are also non-linear, right? You can imagine a war of attrition in which pressures are building up on both sides, but it isn't simply some mathematical calculation that the side with the greatest attrition failed. It depends on their political cohesion. It depends on their underlying economic strength. It depends on their defense industrial base. It depends on their social compact. And the argument has been that although Russia feels it has the upper hand, it has been advancing in late 2024 at a pace that is higher than at almost any time since 2022. There's no denying that. That to keep that up, it would have to continue mobilizing men, by paying them ever higher salaries and eventually moving to general mobilization in ways that would be politically extremely unpalatable for Vladimir Putin. So war is not just a linear process. It's a really complicated thing that waxes and wanes, and you have to think about it in terms of net assessment.
And that's especially true in protracted wars. I'm teaching about World War I right now to undergraduates at Penn, and one of the really striking things about World War I is if you look at the French experience, the German experience, and the Russian experience in particular, given the way that World War I is, one of the triggers for the Russian Revolution, how their experience plays out in World War I in some ways is a function of political economy, of not just what's going on the battlefield, but their economies and the relationship to domestic politics, and how it then impacts their ability to stay in and fight.
And, America has levers on both sides of the political economy of this war. There was a point a few weeks ago where Trump said, oh, yeah, we're going to tighten the screws on Putin and his economy. And the fact that we are throwing up our hands and voting with Putin in the war in the United Nations, saying that they were the aggressor, just like retconning this entire past few years is really mind-boggling. There was a line in a recent Russia Contingency Michael Kaufman podcast where he says, the morale in Munich was actually lower than the morale I saw on the front in Ukraine, which is a sort of absurd concept to grapple with.
I mean, I guess if you were to mount a defense here, what I suspect some Trump folks might say is that they believe that this strategy will give them more leverage over Russia to cut a better deal, and that involves saying things that are very distasteful to the Ukrainians, but they think as a negotiating strategy, that's more likely to get to a better outcome.
I think that's right, Mike, although they've amply shown they are willing to put the screws on Zelensky. If you were looking at this from the perspective of the Kremlin, would you believe General Keith Kellogg when he says, if you don't do a deal, we're going to ram you with sanctions, batter you with economic weapons? Or do you listen to Trump's rhetoric on how we're going to have a big, beautiful economic relationship with Russia, and we're going to, rebuild economic ties, lift sanctions? You're going to be led into the belief that the Americans are really unwilling to walk away from the table because the vice president and others are publicly saying, we don't have any cards, that the Ukrainians are losing. And if we don't cut a deal now, then Russia has the upper hand. It puts them in a position of desperation. And by the way, my big concern is not just that we get a bad deal for Ukraine. It's that we're in a world in which Trump, I think, the idea of spheres of influence appeals to him, dealing with great men one-on-one, people like Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and that what will be on the table is not just Ukraine, but Europe. And that Putin will say, look, Mr. President, you get your Nobel Peace Prize, we get a ceasefire, we do business together and lift sanctions, and you can make money in Moscow. By the way, just one tiny little thing. That NATO thing, you don't like it, I don't like it. Just roll it back to where it was in 1997, west of Poland. That would be great. You'll save a ton of money. Here, I've prepared a spreadsheet for you. And that is the scenario that worries us, a Yalta as much as a Munich.
Yeah, we have a show coming out with Sergei Redchenko where we dove pretty deep into, that, what was Churchill's line? The 60-40.
The back of a cocktail napkin split,
yeah.
Yes.
I mean, at least Churchill was ashamed. It's so wild kind of thinking about the historical echoes here. I mean, I was trying to come up with comparisons, but the only ones I could do were hypotheticals, like McClellan winning in 1864, or Wendell Willkie was actually an interventionist. So I don't know. There was some labor candidate that the Nazis were trying to support in the Democratic Party in 1940, but he, never made it past first base. I don't know. Has there ever been a leadership change which sort of changed a great power conflict this dramatically?
Gorbachev. From the Russian perspective, Jordan, that's Gorbachev, right? From Putin's perspective, he would look back at Glasnost, Perestroika, Gorbachev, the Reykjavik summit. He would look at that as a moment at which a reformist Soviet leader sold the house to the Americans and threw the towel in.
And you also see in lots of wars end with leadership transitions. When wars are going poorly for countries and you have leaders that are, all in and have, gambled for resurrection. If you think about the research of someone like sort of Hein Goemans back in the day, then you have to have a leadership transition in some ways to end wars in some cases if leaders are sort of all in on fighting.
I think the Gorbachev-Trump comparison is a really apt one because it really is like a true conceptual shift in the understanding of, your country's domestic organization as well as role in the world. And, Gorbachev, for all his faults, at least he had this universalist vision of peace, trying to integrate in Europe. And, he wanted to join NATO at one point, right? But going from that to whatever the hell this 19th century mercantilism vision is a really wild one to contemplate.
I think the other thing to remember is Gorbachev's reforms eventually undid the Soviet empire. They undid its alliances and shattered them. In the American case, the American alliance system is not like the Soviet empire. France and the UK are not the Warsaw Pact. We bring something considerably more to the table. It's an alliance of a voluntary alliance. It's a technological, cultural alliance. These are different things. And I worry sometimes that this administration, or some people within it, certainly not everybody, views allies just as these blood-sucking burdens. What they don't fully grasp is how much America has to lose here. And I want to say a word on this because at Munich, and I heard this and I heard it again, the FT have reported recently, we have some Trump administration official threatening to kick Canada out of the Five Eyes Signals Intelligence Sharing Pact. Now, okay, look, the Americans provide the bulk of signals intelligence to allies. There's no surprise about that. But if you lost the 25% provided by non-US allies, it will cost the US a hell of a lot more to get a lot less, and it will lose coverage in places like Cyprus, in the South Pacific, all kinds of things, in the high north, in the Arctic, in the Canadian case. And I think this administration just doesn't understand that in the slightest.
I mean, traditionally what we've seen is, regardless of what political hostility looks like, things like intelligence sharing in something like the Five Eyes context continues. In some ways, the professionals continue doing their jobs. If you see a disruption in that context, that would obviously be a big deal.
I mean, just staying on the Warsaw Pact versus NATO in 2025 today. I mean, America plus its allies is 70% of global GDP. Sort of like Mother Russia plus Soviet satellites. I don't know, probably didn't increase all that much. And the sort of economic outflows that were needed to sustain that, eventually bankrupted the entire enterprise, which is so far from the case of having 10,000 people in Poland and a few more in South Korea and whatnot.
Even put Europe aside for a second, we are in a competition of coalitions with China. And it is through the coalition that we believe that we can sustain technological superiority, economic superiority, military power, et cetera. I mean, look at something like semiconductors and the role that the Netherlands plays in those supply chains, that Japan plays in those supply chains. There are interconnections here. We have thought that we will win because we have the better coalition.
I think there's an interesting question to ask more conceptually is this administration, does it want a rebalancing of its alliances, or does it want a decoupling? You could put it in terms of de-risking and decoupling if you want to sort of echo the China debate here. Does it simply want more European burden sharing, but fundamentally the US will still maintain a presence in Europe, underwrite European security, provide strategic nuclear weapons as a backstop? And that is what many governments are trying to tell themselves. The more radical prospect is that whilst there are some people who envision that outcome, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA, that the president and many of the people around him view things in considerably more radical terms. They're really much more radical terms. It's more of a Maoist cult than a kind of, I'm Eisenhower telling the Europeans to spend more.
Yeah, I mean, there's this quote from Marco Rubio that's really stuck with me from a 2015 Evan Osnos profile, where he talks about how he has not only read, but is currently rereading The Last Lion, which is this kind of truly epic three-part series. I think the middle book alone is most famous, where this is what Rubio was referring to, where Churchill sort of saw the Nazis coming when no one else did. And it has this incredible opening chapter where he's sitting in a bathroom and rewriting his speeches and whatnot. But, Rubio is referring to this moment as comparing it to him standing up to the Obama administration when they're trying to do JCPOA and do a nuclear deal with Iran. And to go from that to like having to sit on TV and blame Ukraine for starting the war, I think is just like the level of cravenness. Like there's different orders and degrees of magnitude.
Jordan, you have to think about this. You have to think about this not in terms of a normal administration in which people do the jobs assigned to them by their bureaucratic standing. You have to think about it like the Kremlin, where you have power verticals, or an Arab dictatorship, where you have different people reporting up to the president, where you have, Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, may say one crazy batshit thing, but actually he has no authority to say it, in which Patrushev, may say another thing, in which Lavrov may say, lay down red lines, but they have no real meaning because there's a sense of detachment from the brain, the power center itself. And ultimately, it'll still Putin who makes the call. I think it's a category error if we try to think about this administration as a normal system of American federal government.
I will say, I can't believe I'm now going to say this, but let me push back and say that there's, I think, a lot of uncertainty about what the Trump administration wants to accomplish here, given the way they have embraced the notion that Trump is a master negotiator, and that in some ways, to be a professor about it, in like a Thomas Schelling threat that leaves something to chance, kind of way, or like madman theory kind of way, that they think that there's a lot of upside here from a bargaining perspective. And most of Trump's national security team is not yet in place. We just had a hearing for the Deputy Secretary of Defense yesterday. Bridge Colby, who's the nominee for Undersecretary, has a hearing coming up, I think, either like next week or the following week. So, a lot of the team is still getting in place.
The thing about Trump 1 is there weren't wars like this. You had 2 years of like sort of normal people who were basically able to stop Trump from doing the craziest stuff. And then the COVID year was kind of a wash. But Trump 2, it's like it matters a lot more. I think it's fair to say over the coming 4 years than it did 2016 to 2020.
It's much more radical. I mean, in the first term, we had John Ratcliffe had his nomination pulled as DNI because he was viewed as inexperienced and not up to the job. Today, John Ratcliffe looks like Dean Acheson compared to the people being put into place. We have to pause and make sure that we recognize the radicalism of what is being put into place around us and ask, when you look at the sober-minded, people who thought about foreign policy, and I include amongst this, people I may disagree with, like Bridge Colby, who will be probably the Pentagon's next policy chief. What is the likely bureaucratic, institutional, political strength they will bring to bear when up against those with a far thinner history of thinking about foreign policy questions?
I haven't done a Trump-China policy show because I don't think we have enough data points yet, but
we don't.
What, if anything, from the past few weeks of how he's thinking and talking about Russia and Ukraine, is it reasonable to pull when thinking about Asia?
I'd just say two quick things. One is I see significant levels of concern among Asian allies. That is, the dominant mood is not, oh, it's fine. They're going to just pull a bunch of stuff from Europe, stick it into Asia, and it'll be a great rebalancing. And number two, I think this is important, is that there is a strong current of opinion that views a potential rapprochement with Russia as being a wedge issue to drive between Russia and China, the so-called reverse Kissinger. Because, Jordan, you know much more about China than I do. I'm not going to comment further on that, but I will say I believe it is an idea that is guiding and shaping and influencing current thinking on the scope of a U.S.-Russia deal.
I think you certainly have a cast of officials who are pretty hawkish on China, which it will be a continuation in some ways of the last administration and the first Trump administration. I think the wild card will be the preferences of the president. There was a New York Times article, I think, a couple of days ago that talked about Trump's desire for a grand bargain with China and, his desire to do, personal face-to-face diplomacy with Xi as a potential way to obtain a deal. Now, I think the reality is that, every American president that has tried to do that kind of deal, whether in person or not, over the last decade has found that there are essentially irreconcilable differences. There's a reason why there's U.S.-China strategic competition, and why that is the dominant has been the dominant issue in some ways of the last several years, and probably will be over the next generation. But Trump may wish to give it a shot, and it sounds like, at least from that article, that he might.
And, we've also had every administration for the past, in the 21st century, try to start their term, try to reset relations with Russia. Stable and predictable relationship was Biden's line, I guess. So, maybe this stuff is just a blip, but I think Shashank's right. I think we're in really uncharted territory. Let's talk about the future of war for a second. Before getting into what is actually happening, let's talk about what isn't. So, Mike, there is this fascinating tension which is playing out in the Silicon Valley, newly national security curious community, where sort of corporate leaders like Dario Amodei and Alex Wong, both esteemed former China Talk guests, kind of talk about AGI as this Manhattan Project type moment where war will never be the same after one nation achieves it. What's your take on that, Mike?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the way advances in frontier artificial intelligence will shape national power in the future of war. And listen, I've been, I think, historically extremely bullish on the impact of AI from a national defense perspective. I remember when Paul Scharre and I and a couple of other people were in a small conference room at CNAS with basically everybody in Washington, D.C. that cared about AI and national security, and now it's obviously a much bigger space, and that's a good thing. But I think the notion that AGI will inherently transform sort of power in the future of war in that kind of context makes a couple of assumptions that it's not clear to me are correct. The first is that there's essentially a 1-0 binary. You don't have AGI and then you have AGI, and that when you get there, sort of there's this magical jump in capabilities, which essentially means you can then solve all sorts of problems you have been trying to solve that you couldn't solve before. So it leads to a dramatic step change in capabilities. That might be true. It also might be true that you have continuing growth in AI capabilities, and we kind of bicker about whether they constitute AGI or not, over time. In part for very clear human psychology reasons. And so you never have that one specific moment, yet you still have ever increasing frontier AI capabilities that militaries can then potentially adopt. This to me, though, frankly, points out, because I think the other assumption, is that there's the technical breakthroughs are the same thing as government adoption, which I think everything we know about the history of military innovation suggests is incorrect. In that the thing that I worry about the most is that U.S. companies lead the world in AI breakthroughs, but the U.S. government lags in effective adoption for varieties of reasons that have to do with legacy bureaucracy, budgeting systems, relationships between the executive and Congress, all sorts of normal bureaucratic politics, essentially, issues, which could make adopting those breakthroughs quickly very difficult. Whereas, maybe the PRC gets there, maybe China gets there later, but due to the way their system sets up, adopts the upside faster.
All right. That was a lot that I want to unpack relatively slowly. So first, we have AI evals for how good it is at coding and math and whatever. What is the AI eval that will convince Mike Horowitz that this is, the next, the next stealth bomber or the next nuclear weapon or what have you?
I just think that's the wrong way to think about it. AI is a general purpose technology, not a specific widget. And so if what we are looking for is the AI nuclear weapon or the AI stealth bomber, I think we're sort of missing the point. When general purpose technologies impact national power, they do so, directly and indirectly. They do so directly through, all right, here, we have electricity, now we can do X. We have the combustion engine, now we can do X. They do so indirectly through the economic returns that you get, which then, fuel your ability to invest in the military and how advanced your economy is. And so, I think AI is likely to have it arguably is already having both of those characteristics. The thing that's not entirely clear yet is whether there's essentially a linear relationship between how advanced your AI is and what the national security returns look like. And part of that, again, is informed by my view of the bureaucratic politics here, because I view adoption challenges as the biggest ones for the national security community in the United States.
Just to like stay on defining terms, like the direct applications, we're talking about like the AI for science, we're still in the very early phases, but there's a really fun book by Mike O'Hanlon called The Science of War, or I think it was the Senkaku Paradox, where like at the end of it, he has this very cool table of like all of the different vectors on which sort of technology can get better over like a 5, 10, and 20-year horizon. And like, you show me some crazy material science breakthroughs that you can put in weapon systems, and like, I will be convinced that this stuff is really real and gonna matter on a near-term horizon on the battlefield. But I think just like the Dario Amodei framework of like, this is going to radically change things in 2 to 3 years strikes me as really not grappling with the challenges both on the scientific side as well as on the adoption side. Maybe Shashank, on the before we do adoption, anything on the sort of like what this can potentially unlock that we would want to talk about?
I think we could split the applications of that general purpose technology up a million different ways. The way I have tended to do it in my head, which is not novel, it's probably plagiarized from people like Mike long ago, is thinking about insight, autonomy, and decision support. And insight is the kind of intelligence applications. You know, can you churn your way through satellite images? Can you use AI to spot all the Russian tanks? Autonomy is, can you navigate from A to B? Can this platform do something itself with less or no human supervision or intervention? So the paradigmatic case today, which is highly impactful, is terminal guidance using AI object recognition to circumvent electronic warfare in Ukraine. And I can bore you with all kinds of interesting details on what we're seeing in Ukraine from a reporting perspective. And the third interesting thing, which I think is the bit that, Mike, you know about, you've been talking about it, but my readers, it's a challenge to get readers and even editors as interested in it, which is decision support, which includes things that nobody really understands in the normal world, command and control. Right? The ability of AI to organize, coordinate, synchronize the business of warfare, whether that's a kind of a sensor shooter network at the tactical level for a company or a kind of battalion, or whether it's a full theater scale system of the kind that European Command 18 Corps in EUCOM has been assisting Ukraine with for the last 3 years, which is looking across the battlescape, fusing Russian phone records, overhead radio frequency satellite returns, synthetic aperture radar images, all kinds of other things into a coherent picture that it then used to guide commanders to act more quickly and effectively than the other side. That's difficult to define, but if we're talking about transformative applications, I think that is really where we need to be looking carefully. And we can say more on that.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And look, General Donahue is a visionary, but when it's come to what AI application can look like for the military today, and in trying to at least experimentally integrate more cutting edge capabilities. To the Dario, point though, it's all a question of sort of time frame and use cases, and that if you imagine like AGI as you instantly have access to 10,000 Einsteins who like don't sleep and don't get tired and are just like there doing the work for you from a research and development perspective all the time, then that's going to lead to lots of breakthroughs that then will generate specific use cases. That could lead to new material science breakthroughs that decrease radar cross sections. That could lead to new advances in batteries that finally mean that the dream of directed energy becomes, more of a reality. That can lead to advances in sensing in the oceans that, create like new ways of countering submarines. It could lead to all sorts of different like kinds of things. The challenge is it's difficult in some ways, like ex ante, to know like exactly which you'll get when.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dario would say that your framework, Shashank, is the weak sauce And like what he's talking about is an entirely new paradigm. But it is, and maybe this is our transition to Ukraine today, because like it is important to understand what is happening today, particularly because we have had a high intensity war for 3 years with two countries that are on or pretty close to the technological frontier of all this stuff. And just like over the course of World War I, particularly on the Western Front, you know, it takes a while to reach the frontier of what today's technology can give you. And there are certain things which you know, are happening, and there are certain sci-fi things that people may have predicted would have happened in 2020, which are not.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think the one that is super interesting because of the pace of change is the autonomy piece. And just to sum this up, when I was talking to Ukrainian first-person view FPV strike operators, my colleagues were talking to them maybe 18 months ago, they were saying, yeah, if you're a member of an elite unit with loads of training, you can get the hit rate up to 75%. But if you're an average strike pilot, this is not easy to stick those goggles on, navigate this thing. You know, you don't know when the jamming's going to kick in and cut the signal. You have to get it just right. You're getting like 15%, 20% hit rates, maybe. What I am seeing with the companies and the entities building these AI-guided systems for the final 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters, and increasingly up to 2 kilometers in some cases, is that the engagement range is going up. So you can home in on the target beyond the range of any plausible local jamming device. That's a huge deal. But more importantly, the hit rate you're getting is up to 80% plus. And that's phenomenal. That changes the economics, the cost per kill. That changes the economics of this from an attrition basis. But there are all these interesting ripple effects, right? Because suddenly, if you have a thing I can give to, you know, Jordan, to you and I, and we can say, hey, fly this thing towards that Russian tank. Suddenly, we don't have to spend weeks training you up. You can achieve this with like 30 minutes training. And think about what that unlocks for a force, particularly sitting here in Europe, where we have these shrunken armies with no reserves, with the manpower requirements as well, with the training times to bring new people in when you have attrition in a war in the first round. So this little tactical innovation, terminal guidance, AI-enabled, looks very narrow, but it has all these super interesting and consequential ripple effects on the economics of attrition, the cost per kill, lethality levels, the effectiveness of jamming, and on manpower and labor requirements. That's why it's so important to get into the weeds and look at these changes.
I mean, look, I think we're seeing at scale something that we like kind of thought might happen, but it just always been theoretical rather than something real. Like the argument for why you would need autonomy to overcome electronic warfare has been, you know, like obvious for decades, like frankly. When there were questions of is the technology there? Like, do you want to do it this way? There are like a bunch of different kinds of things. What we've seen is that when you are fighting conventional war at scale, you basically have to. If you want to increase your hit rate and you want to overcome jamming, since, you know, if you're facing electronic warfare, you can update software to try to counter the jamming. And like you see that. You can try to harden against jamming, and you can see that, although that increases costs. You can use different concepts of operation to try to, you know, like get around it, sort of fool the local jammers. Like you can do that. But if to the extent that autonomy becomes a hack that lets you to, you know, your smart point, like train and operate systems more effectively in much less time, like that's a game changer. And it's not one that we should expect to be confined there. Imagine all of the shaheeds that Russia fires at Ukraine with similar autonomous terminal guidance out to a couple of kilometers. Imagine all sorts of weapon systems with those kinds of capabilities. You know, we're seeing this at scale in Ukraine in a way we just, again, like we had imagined. And it's just to be clear, it's not just in the air. And also, like, let me now just give my 15-second rant on the term drone. We are currently using the term drone to refer to a combination of cruise missiles, loitering munitions, ISR platforms, and uncrewed aerial systems that themselves launch munitions. All of those are getting called drones right now, even though we actually have correct names for them. And it might be like helpful if we use those names since we're talking about different capabilities, essentially. But yeah, I mean, like +1 to everything.
Mike, do you want us to use? Do you want me to use in my readers UAS, UUVs? I'm going to get sacked if I start using all those acronyms.
Shashank, I want you to get a different job so I can read all the articles that you wrote without having to guess. And I know where your byline is. I mean, that really is the answer. But anyways, we'll come back to that later. Sorry, I'll cut that rant out. Apologies, Shashank.
That's all right. You're welcome to keep it in. Mike, I think it's an interesting thing I'd like to ask you about here, since you've raised the issue of different domains, right? One of the questions I often get asked by readers is, where are all the drone swarms, right? Where are the swarms that we were promised? And maybe this is a kind of ungrateful thing because we bank a bit of technology and we are desensitized to it and then we forget everything else. But what interests me is writing about the undersea domain a while ago and submarine hunting. I was struck by how difficult it is. This is obvious physics to communicate and send radio frequency underwater. You can't, right? Radio waves don't penetrate water very much, if at all. And acoustic modems and things like that are very clunky. So the technologies we have relied on for things like control signals, navigational signals, oversight in the air domain, they operate very differently in places where signals don't travel as much, the curvature of the earth or in the water. Do you think that uncrewed technology and autonomy operates in some kind of fundamentally different way in those domains, or it's going to be less capable in those places?
That is a great question. I mean, let me give you a broad answer and then the answer to the specific sort of undersea question. And that I think we've essentially entered the era of precise mass in war, where advances in AI and autonomy and advances in manufacturing and the diffusion of the basics of precision guidance mean that everybody essentially can now do precision, and do it at lower cost. But that applies in every domain. That applies in space. That applies in the air for surveillance. That applies in the air for strike. That could apply to ground vehicles, and that can apply underwater. Now, and on the surface. Now, the specific way that it plays out will depend on the specifics of the domain and on what is most militarily useful. Like, for example, if the question is like, where are the swarms we are promised? And what we end up with is a world where one person is overseeing maybe, 50 strike weapons that are autonomously piloting the last, 2 kilometers toward a target. There may be actually military reasons why we don't want them to communicate with each other, because if they communicated with each other, then that would be a signal that could be hacked or jammed, which then gets you back into the EW issue that you're trying to avoid. So there's an interaction in some ways between the swarms we were promised and some of the ways that you might want to use autonomy to try to get around the electronic warfare challenge. I mean, what that points to then is as always, huge importance of cybersecurity in delivering, essentially any of this. But that I think is, so I think part of the issue is if swarms potentially are vulnerable to some of the same issues that face FPV drones and other kinds of systems in different kinds of strike situations. And so wouldn't be surprising to me if you then move more toward sort of precise mass in the context of autonomy without swarming in the short term, without swarming in a world where you think that you're getting jammed. Now, underwater, I think you absolutely have the physics issue that you've pointed out. Like, communication underwater is just more difficult. And to the extent that something like swarming requires real-time coordination, that becomes even more difficult the further away things are from each other. And so it wouldn't be surprising then that the underwater domain would be challenging here. And to take it back to the AGI conversation we were having, like, 2 notes I think that are relevant here. Like, one, the where were the swarms we were promised question reminds me that how we define artificial general intelligence often is a moving target. Like, we're constantly shifting the goalposts because once AI can do things, we call it programming. And so, like, artificial general intelligence is always the thing that's like over the horizon. Going back to like the previous conversation we had in some of like my belief about that there might not be one AGI moment, it reflects that way that the definition of AI has tended to be a moving target. But specifically, if you're in the AI will transform everything paradigm, one of the things you would probably try to use AGI to do that would have transformative impact would be to solve some of these communication issues in the undersea domain that can limit the utility of potentially limit the utility of uncrewed systems in mass in undersea. That's, like an example essentially of like a science problem that then maybe, major advances in AI help you address when you have like paradigm shifting AI.
All right, so we're recording this after the show, but me and Mike, we had a little more to get off our chests. All right, Mike, so slightly adjacent to this, there are two odd theories why a U.S. China-Taiwan war could kick off. One is like China's dependence on TSMC being a really important independent variable in their kind of willingness to go to war. And I think second, this idea that like if one side gets AGI, then the other would need to do a preemptive strike to stop their adversary, I don't know, like creating Dr. Manhattan or something.
Sure. I mean, those are great questions. I think a lot of what we know from the theory and reality of the history of international relations and military conflict suggests that war in either case would be pretty unlikely. So let me start with the Taiwan scenario. I am extremely nervous, to be clear, about the prospect of a potential conflict between China and Taiwan. I think that there is real risk there. But the notion of China essentially starting a war with Taiwan over TSMC would be like kind of without precedent. Or like, put another way, there are lots of paths through which I think we could end up with a war between China and Taiwan. The one that keeps me up at night is not an attack on TSMC.
Ben Thompson just wrote a piece where his he is defining as an important independent variable in Beijing's calculation of whether or not to start a war over Taiwan, to what extent they are reliant on Taiwanese fabs to kind of, I don't know, function their economy or whatever. Is this like, how do you think about that line of argument in a broader historical context?
Like the best version of the argument, if you wanted to make it, is probably that if China views itself as economically dependent on Taiwan, it would then seek to, figure out ways to get access to the technology that it needs from Taiwan. And you could imagine that effort happening in a couple of different ways. Like one is to actually attempt to mimic what TSMC, does, which obviously they're already attempting to do. One would be attempting to coerce Taiwan in one way or another to try to get better access to TSMC. But starting a war with Taiwan, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are likely to die, and which could trigger a general war with the United States and other countries in the Indo-Pacific over the fabs, I think that's relatively unlikely, since China would have has lots of other ways to try to potentially get access to chips that they need.
Yeah. So you keep coming back to the straw man, which isn't even the straw man I'm pointing at, because I think that's the dumber version of the straw man of go into TSMC to take the chips. But there's another line of argument that like, as long as China still needs TSMC and is able to buy NVIDIA, 5.3 nanometer NVIDIA chips and like needs the output from those TSMC fabs to run its economy in a normal, modern way, then that would drive down the likelihood of China wanting to start a conflict.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument in that direction, which is to say that economic dependence could generate incentives to not start a conflict as well. My belief tends to be that the probability of war between China and Taiwan will be driven by broader socioeconomic, broader like sociopolitical factors.
Yeah, I would also agree. I'm putting on my analyst hat for a second. I mean, the sort of domestic Chinese political dynamics, whatever's happening on a policy perspective, whatever's happening in domestic Taiwanese politics, the perception of America's willingness and Japan's willingness to fight for Taiwan all seem to me to be like orders of magnitude more relevant than like the percentage share of high-end chips that China is consuming from SMIC versus TSMC. But let's come to the other kind of version of this of like, my adversary is about to get AGI, so therefore I will want to Stuxnet their data centers and, I don't know, Operation Paperclip all their AI engineers and, I don't know, start World War III over a breakthrough in artificial intelligence. Where are you on that one, Mike?
I think that the argument in some ways is insufficiently specified. And I will say my views on this could change, but for a situation in which, say, China would attack the United States because it feared the United States was about to reach, AGI, that presumes essentially a couple of things. First, it presumes that AGI essentially is some kind of like finish line in a race or 1-0 binary where like once you get there, there's a step change in capabilities, and that there's no advantage to being second in that case, that it's a step change in capabilities that would immediately negate everything that everybody else has. Or I guess that's two assumptions. One is that it's binary. The second is that it's a breakthrough that negates everything that everybody else has. So those are two assumptions. The third assumption is that advances are transparent such that the attacker would know both what to hit and when to hit it to have sort of maximum impact. And I think there are a lot of reasons to believe that all of those assumptions are like potentially incorrect, in that it's not clear. I mean, obviously, there are enormous advances in AI that are transforming our society, and that will continue. It's not clear that there will be one magical moment where we hit artificial general intelligence. Frankly, the history of AI suggests that like 15 years from now, we could still be arguing about it because we tend to move the goalposts of what counts as AI, since anything we definitively have figured out how to do, we tend to call programming, and then say that it's in support of humans. It's also not clear that advances would be transparent, and that countries would have timely intelligence. And you need to be not just really confident, but almost absolutely certain that if somebody got to AGI first, that you're just done, that you can't be a fast follower, and probably that it negates your nuclear deterrent. But in that situation, like if you believe that AGI is a 1-0 binary, one, that if you get it, it negates everything else, two, and that there'll be perfect transparency, three, in that case, maybe there would be some kind of incentive for a strike, except that military history suggests that these are super, super unlikely. If you don't have and that what we're talking about in this context is a bolt from the blue. Not the US and China are in crisis and on the verge of escalation, and then there's some kind of strike against some facilities. We're talking about like literally we're in steady state and somebody like starts a war. It's actually pretty unprecedented from a military history perspective. And leaders tend to want to find other ways around these kinds of situations, that if you even doubted a little bit that AGI would completely negate everything you have, then you might want to wait and see if you can catch up rather than like start a war with a nuclear armed power with second strike capabilities like that. It's so dangerous.
I am sold by arguments 1 and 3, and I think if the story of DeepSeek tells you anything, it's that like it's not even fast following like 3 years with the hydrogen bomb and the Cold War. It's fast following like 3 months with a model you can distill. So, if you're that patient, and if it's not really this like 0 to 1 thing where all of a sudden America invents time travel, but I guess the sort of maybe the more relevant data point is less like America like nuking the Soviet Union in 1946 just because we can, but something that looks a lot more like Iran and Israel in the 2000s and 2010s, where you don't literally have missiles being fired and airstrikes, but you have this like increasingly nasty world of targeted assassinations and, Stuxnet hacking of facilities where, like what is a pretty kind of happy-go-lucky world in San Francisco now when it comes to developing these AI models becomes a lot more dark and messy. So maybe, Mike, what could trigger that potential timeline? And like, what does that look like once both parties presumably start to play that game?
I mean, let me be more dire and say, like, what's the difference between that and the status quo? Obviously, like, there's a difference between that if we're talking about like assassination attempts, like those kinds of things. But I mean, I think every AI company around the world, including PRC AI companies, is probably under cyber siege on a daily basis from varieties of malicious actors, some of them potentially backed by states trying to like steal their various secrets. And so, like, to me, this falls into like a couple of categories. Like, one is cyber attacks to steal things, like hacking essentially for the purposes of theft. A second would be cyber attacks for the purposes of sabotage, like a Stuxnet like kind of situation. A third would be sort of external to a network, but like physical things short of war, like espionage, ish activities to disrupt a development community. So on the cyber attack one, I mean, I think there is a tendency sometimes to overestimate the extent to which there are like magic cyber weapons that let you like instantly intrude on like whatever network you want. I mean, look, are there 0 days? Like, yes. Are cyber capabilities real? Yes. I mean, lots of governments, including the United States government, have talked about that. But I'm not sure it's sort of is easy to say like break into a network that is, to be clear, pretty hardened against attack. Just like flip a switch, like, oh, today we're going to launch our cyber attacks. And so it's not. I think both have some effectiveness questions about some of those things, frankly, but also I think that those networks are constantly being tested. So that's thing one. Thing two, if we're talking about like Stuxnet kind of attacks, that was really hard. I mean, Stuxnet is probably the most successful like cyber to kinetic cyber attack, arguably in known history. It's this enormous operational success for Israel against Iran.
But the difference with Stuxnet versus what we're talking about, right, is like, a data center in Virginia or Austin is like much more connected to the world. They'll hire a janitor. It's not like in a bunker somewhere.
Sure. I mean, those are more accessible, but they're also more data centers. I mean, this gets into we're talking about commercial technology where like targeting any one data center in particular is not likely to, grind all AI efforts to a halt. And frankly, if there is one AI data center in particular where there is, I mean, to go to that transparency point that I made before, where there is widespread acknowledgement that what happens at that physical location will be decisive for the future of global power, that's going to be lockdown. And the company will have incentives to sort of lock it down, just like frankly, defense primes have incentives to lock their systems down, even if we're not talking about defense companies, or that frankly, companies like Microsoft and Google have incentives to lock down non-AI capabilities. So it's not now again, my point here isn't that there won't be attempts and even that some of those attempts won't succeed, but just I think there's sometimes a tendency to exaggerate the ease of attack and its sort of structural impact in a world where if we're talking about it hitting like a thing that's very accessible in Virginia, that means there's probably things very accessible in other places that also can potentially do the job. Now, the like toughest one of these is the espionage one, where you're talking about essentially like covert operations targeting companies. And I mean, listen, it wouldn't surprise me if some of those companies are like, frankly, like intelligence targets for foreign governments like now. The challenge to me for this analytically is that these arguments quickly enter the realm of non-falsifiability. Like, if I tell you that I think this kind of espionage or that kind of espionage like wouldn't be that likely, you could be like, well, what about this? What about this? And like, we're not going to be able to resolve it with facts. non-falsifiable threat arguments, essentially like make me nervous analytically. Maybe this is the academic in me then like makes me want to like push back a little bit in some ways, because I feel like if an argument is like that legit, we should be able to specify it in a clearly falsifiable way.
Like what? Like, give me the good straw man of that.
The best straw man argument would be if you could basically demonstrate that the PRC is not really trying to like target for collection varieties of AI companies, and that it would be like relatively easy for them to do so, then frankly, that would raise a question of why they're not doing that now. And then we get like back then to the question before about like, what's the point at which they would start those kinds of activities? They would need to have like enough information that they believe that some company or set of companies is getting close to AGI, but not enough that they would have done something like, like done something previously. We're essentially like assuming they've got like good stuff on the shelf that they would like pull off if they have to. The non-falsifiable part is about like to what extent they could ramp up attacks, to what extent there would be defenses against those attacks, and to what extent those non-kinetic strikes would have impacts that would actually meaningfully delay the development of a technology, which is another way of saying, I guess, like my prior is that there's lots of espionage happening all the time. And so I kind of want to see more in this argument what exactly folks mean when they talk about escalation.
One of the things that I think has been remarkable about like China and at least how it deals with like foreigners is that you haven't seen what Russia did with all these targeted assassinations. And, the kind of the sharpest we've gotten, at least with dealing with like white people, has been the handful of Canadians which were grabbed and ultimately let go after a few years in captivity following the Wang Wenzhou arrest. People are very focused on China starting World War III out of the blue. But I think there are also world states in which China becomes like much more unpleasant, while not necessarily kicking off World War III.
Yeah, so, like I'm a definitive skeptic on the China starts World War III over AGI point. Yeah. I buy the notion that China could become more unpleasant as, we approach some sort of AGI place, like including, like non-kinetic kinds of things, espionage kinds of things, et cetera. I think I tend to maybe not view those as decisive, as decisive maybe as some others do, sort of potentially. I think you're right that they certainly could become a lot more unpleasant. And like, if the question is like, why not? Why they haven't already? I mean, the answer is probably twofold. Like one, there's an attribution question. Like, suppose you had like Chinese espionage that involves like doing physical harm to AI researchers or like something. If they were caught doing that, they've now potentially started a war with the United States, and they're like back in the place for why they wouldn't launch a military strike in the first place. If it's non-attributable, then the question is like, all right, like exactly how much are they going to be able to do? And I mean, I wonder whether there is something then about their broader economic ties with the United States that maybe makes some of the worst kinds of these things less likely in a way that maybe is less troubling to a Russia.
All right, now back to the original recording with Shashank as well. Well, I think this is a decent transition to precise mass in the China-Taiwan context. What can and can't we infer about military technological innovation in Ukraine to what a war would look like over the next few years?
I mean, I think it's not necessarily the specific technologies, but it is the vibes. And by that, like what I mean is it's the advances in AI and autonomy, advances in manufacturing, the push for mass on the battlefield that, we see that already in publicly available like documents and reporting on how the PRC is thinking about Taiwan. We see that already in the U.S. in the context of Admiral Paparo and Indo-PACOM and the Hellscape concept, or something like the Replicator Initiative in the like sort of Biden DOD. And like full disclosure, I helped drive that, so certainly have my biases. And we see that if you look at some of the systems that Taiwan has been acquiring over the last couple of years. And so I think you essentially have a growing recognition that more autonomous mass, or what I'd call precise mass, will be helpful in the Indo-Pacific. It might not be it's unlikely to be the exact same systems that are on the battlefield in Ukraine, but variants of those scoped to the vastness of the Indo-Pacific.
So I have a few thoughts on this. I think one way to also think about what Mike is saying is, for any given capability, you can have more intelligence that is defined however you like, whether that's in terms of autonomy or capacity to do the task on the edge, at a lower price point. And that capability could be a short 15-kilometer range small warhead strike system in the anti-infantry role. It could be a 100-kilometer system to take out armor with bigger warheads, or it could be significantly longer range systems that have to be able to defeat complex defensive threats. And obviously, the third of those things is always going to be more expensive than the first. But what that revolution in precise mass, if it is a revolution, we can debate it. If that's what it is, what it does is push you down. The capability per dollar is going up and up. That is, I think, the essential point.
And that, just to be clear, that's the reverse of what we saw for 40 years.
It's a really good point, yeah.
Where in the context of the precision revolution, where you were paying more and more for each capability. Whereas now we are seeing the inverse of that in the era of precise mass.
I think the one thing I will add to this, though, is that although that's true, is the transformative effect comparable across each level of sophistication or capability or range, right? So are there specific things to SBV type systems because they, for instance, rely on consumer electronics, consumer airframes, quadcopters? They can draw upon a defense industrial base or an industrial base that has existed for commercial drones and so on and so forth. They're battery powered, small batteries. Is it easier to have that capability revolution for intelligent mass, precise mass at that end of the spectrum? Relative to building a jet-powered system that has to be able to do 100 kilometers, travel significantly further, has to get through defeat mechanisms that may be able to have IR thermal imaging. Is the revolution comparable at each end?
Yeah, it's the latter thing. So I was with you up until the end about defeat all of those systems, because I think the thing that's so challenging about this for a military like the United States is it's a different way of thinking about fighting. In that you're talking about firing salvos and firing at mass, as opposed to we're going to fire one thing and it's going to evade all the adversary air defenses and sort of hit the target. But look at Iran's Shahed 136. That's a system that can go, depending on the variant, 1,000+ kilometers. That can carry a reasonable size warhead that in theory could have greater or lesser levels of autonomy in it, depending on the brain essentially that you plug into it. And so that's not going to be as sophisticated a system as say a advanced American cruise missile that costs, $3 million or something. But it doesn't have to be, because the idea is that these are complements where you're then firing in mass to attrit enemy air defenses. So then you're a more sophisticated weapon, then it's easier for it to get through. But it's a different way of thinking about operating. And that creates all sorts of challenges beyond just developing the system or buying the system.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. This gets us to a phrase, Mike, that is very popular in our world, and you and I have talked about this, and which is the mix of forces that you have, and specifically the concept of a high-low mix. That is, it's not just, small drones will replace everything. It is that you have a high-low mix, and you will have some, albeit fewer, very expensive high-end capabilities that can perform extremely exquisite, difficult tasks or operate at exceptionally high ranges. And then you will have a lot more in quantity terms of lower end systems that are cheaper, more numerous, and that will not be as capable. They can't do things that a Storm Shadow cruise missile or an ATACMS missile can do, but they can do it at a scale the Storm Shadow can't do or the ATACMS can't do. And I think that this is one idea that is most difficult when I find I'm writing about this for ordinary people who are maybe not into defense, is explaining the mix, the interaction of those two ends of the spectrum. And here's the difficult bit. Pinning down what is the right mix. Do we know it yet? Will we know it? How will we know? Does it differ for countries? That, I think, is the bit where I'm at and struggling to understand all of this.
I think it probably differs for countries, and it probably even within countries differs by the contingency. For example, if you are fighting if you're back in a forever war kind of situation and you're the United States, then you might want a different mix of forces than if you're very focused on the Indo-Pacific and on China in particular. What it means, like essentially what comprises your high-low mix probably changes. Like the way that I've tended to think about this is you have essentially trucks, which are the things that like get you there. Then you have brains, which is the brains or the software that we're plugging in. And then you have either the sort of the sensor or the weapon or the sort of piece. And in some ways, what I think we're learning from Ukraine that is applicable in the Taiwan context is sometimes it matters a lot less what the truck is than what the brain is.
I think the other thing that I struggle to get across, or that I really try and get across, is the relationship between the precise bit and the mass bit, and particularly the role of legacy capabilities in this, right? The great conflict I see today is in the artillery domain, right? Do strike drones replace, supplant artillery? They are, as we now know, and I wouldn't have thought this was the case, but I'm clearly less radical, is that they now inflict the majority of casualties in Ukraine, strike drones, not artillery, as was the case at the early phase of the conflict. But there is this really interesting line in, I think it's in the British Land Operating Concept, or it's in the British Army Review, published a couple of years ago. But I want to read it because I think it gets to something I've thought about. It says, there is a danger that the enemy will be able to generate more combat echelons than we have sensors or high-end long-range weaponry to service. Right.
Yep.
And that's the point. You can have these wonderful AI kill chains that can do remarkable things. They can spot anyone moving, can feed that data back to your weapons. But if you don't have the firepower to prosecute those targets and then keep prosecuting them week after week in a protracted conflict, you don't have deterrence. And I think that is what we are waking up to now.
That's the important thing here. The notion that you didn't need a high-low mix, that you could just go high, presumes short wars, where you can just use your high-end assets and you sort of shock and awe the adversary into submission, whether, again, like we're talking about a forever war kind of situation, like, or in the Indo-Pacific. If you're fighting in a world of protraction, then you need much deeper magazines in all of the ways, including in your platforms, frankly. Now, maybe in that world, like AI is actually helping you with what you're manufacturing and like how you're manufacturing, and can deliver like a bunch of like other benefits in some ways on the battlefield. But I think a big challenge here is like, I don't think that these capabilities necessarily mean that there's no role for traditional artillery. Although if they can do the same, although look, like anything in military history, if you get to a point where they can do the same job better at lower cost, then they will eventually displace those capabilities, or militaries that don't adopt them will fall behind. It's not, I think we're more at a complement than a substitute stage right now for those capabilities, but things could change. The challenge that right now for, say, like a military like the US is you have all these legacy capabilities, but and maybe you wish to invest less in them to be able to invest more in precise mass capabilities, which, to be clear, is something I advocate. But then the question becomes, what are you doing with those legacy capabilities and when, across what timeframes?
Yes.
But it does tell you some things that are really important from a force planning perspective. For example, the like one ring to rule them all approach to air combat that led to the F-35, where you're just going to have like one airplane that like one fighter that will like operate forever and is useful for like, and you presume will be useful for every single military contingency. Turns out that means it's optimized for none of them. And that then generates a bunch of risk. And one of the things that I think that the like new administration is probably going to be doing is figuring out how to address those risks. Like, I don't want to hate on the F-35 and its stubby little wings. Sorry, I'll stop now.
I'm really glad you raised F-35, because I think this gets to another one of my sort of points of thinking, which is, you said if it can do the same job, right? What are the jobs it can and can't do? Because, when you look at a simple mission, let's take an anti-tank guided missile. It's looking pretty clear to me that a kind of mid-range, low-cost strike system, one-way attack strike system, is looking like it can do the job of an ATGM very effectively at significantly lower cost. And therefore, then unless the ATGMs also get transformed, then you're going to see a supplanting of roles. However, I'm also acutely conscious that we are thinking about some battlefields that are in some ways uncluttered, right? We're looking at a stretch of the Donbass in which anything that moves is going to be the target that you want to hit, right? It's going to be a Russian military vehicle. You're not going to accidentally hit a school bus full of children. In the Taiwan Strait, you are using your object recognition or algorithms to target shipping. Like, you're not accidentally going to hit something in the context of a amphibious invasion of Taiwan.
Yeah, like if the balloon goes up, it's not like there's lots of like commercial fishing just like chilling in the strait.
Well, and if it is, it's probably MSS operatives. So you're fine. But look, I mean, in the air power situation too, right? You may be doing stuff like this. However, urban warfare is not going away. I'm imagining fights over Tallinn, over Taipei, over cluttered, complex, multi-layered subterranean environments like Gaza, like Beirut, like places like that. And I worry a lot more about the timeline over which autonomy will suffice. And to end on one last point before I kind of spin off, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, believes that an autonomous fighter aircraft will not be viable prior to 2040. Now, maybe that's ultra conservative, but that's based on some of the assumptions about the tasks they think it will need to do. And I know you have your debate over NGAD and long-run capabilities. So are there limits to this process, I guess what I'm throwing out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the limits are how good the technology is. And frankly, like I've argued this for years in the context of autonomous weapon systems. The last place that you would ever see autonomous weapon systems is, I think, in urban warfare.
Yes.
There are like not only whatever ethical, moral issues that might surround that, also that's just way harder to do.
Sure.
Than figuring out whether like something is an adversary ship or an adversary plane or an like adversary tank or something like that in a relatively uncluttered battlefield.
Well, I guess the second part was to do the air picture, right? And countries are now having to decide what is our air power going to look like in 2040,
yeah.
And how much can we rely on the technology being good enough by then? I mean, you're right. That is the question. Will it be good enough? But you have to make the bet now. You have to make the judgment now because of the timelines of building these things.
Right. So there's like two questions there. So like one is how good is the AI technology? And I think, frankly, even if Dario is overestimating how quickly we get to something universally recognized as artificial general intelligence. And just to be clear, like, dude's way smarter than me. And like, I'm not saying he's like necessarily wrong, just that I think that there's uncertainty here. The like super, super smart and thoughtful. Frankly, and also side note, that CEOs of today's leading companies post their thoughts and come on shows like this is so super useful. For like, now that I've like taken off my Defense Department hat and like back in academia for like understanding how, a lot of the people like designing cutting edge technology are thinking about it and its interaction with government policy and militaries. It's actually incredibly useful that like Dario, Sam Altman, like others actually like post at length in some ways about like their thoughts on these kinds of things. So if you're talking about like what the future of like a next gen airframe would look like or what a collaborative combat aircraft could do, my bet is that the militaries are underestimating how quickly AI will advance and the ability to do that. What they might be accurately assessing is, given the way the process of designing new capabilities works today, and given today's manufacturing capabilities, how long it would take to actually design and roll out a new system. Because in some ways, really shortening that timeline and thinking about this from like a parochial American perspective, is way more ambitious than what we were attempting to do with Replicator. And I expect the new team actually will continue to push forward a lot of those things, whether they call it Replicator or not. And just in that you could have a scenario in which your AI is at a level that you believe you could have more autonomous operations of a collaborative combat aircraft, and you have some advances in manufacturing that mean you could produce maybe more of them at a slightly lower price point, but still be unable to do so before, say, 2040 for varieties of like bureaucratic and budgetary reasons.
All right. So we did a bit of a kind of scenario analysis of like what Trump's strategic outlook could be towards, great power relations. And I think it's also worth doing a bit of that kind of future forecasting of different pathways that they could go down from a defense technology innovation perspective. And maybe the best place to start is to look back over the past 4 years of sort of where the Biden administration made progress, where it didn't, why it didn't on certain dimensions. And I don't know how Mike is feeling looking back at his past 4 years of work.
My bottom line would be, I feel like we accomplished a lot in getting the ball really moving from a defense innovation perspective, and specifically in moving toward greater investments in lots of important next generation capabilities like collaborative combat aircraft, varieties of precise mass through the Replicator initiative. But there was a lot more to be done, and it was a journey. In that, I think that in two ways, one was bringing everybody along on that defense innovation journey to get to the point where folks bought into the importance of some of these emerging capabilities for the future of warfare, specifically in the Indo-Pacific. And then there's what we could accomplish before the clock ran out. So to, start with the first piece, sort of like taking everybody on the journey, in some ways, nothing happens in the Pentagon without getting lots of people on board. And I think it took a little while for there to be consensus in some ways on the state of the defense industrial base. And that, if you look at varieties of think tank reports about what DoD should do differently, there are often all of these suggestions like, oh, DoD needs to scale more of this system, scale more of that system, build more of that. And all of that is great, except that even if you fully fund really exquisite munitions like the long-range anti-ship missile or or JASSM-ER or something like that, you're going to be really capacity constrained because those facilities just have limits, and you can change those limits or you can't change those limits like that. And so, but what can you then do to scale capability relevant for the Indo-Pacific in the short term? And the answer is precise mass capabilities. It's more attritable systems, more AI-enabled and autonomous systems that maybe sometimes, but not always, frankly, are built by non-traditional companies. And there's a coalition of the willing that push through all of those in a bunch of different contexts, including Replicator, which DIU I think did a brilliant job of leading implementation of, and that generated I think some growing momentum. But it also highlighted some real limits in that reprogramming 0.05% of the defense budget to fund multiple thousands of attritable autonomous systems for the Indo-Pacific under the first bet of the Replicator initiative required over 40 briefings to Congress, including a ton by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who's really busy. And obviously congressional oversight, really important. But that degree of effort required to reprogram essentially less than $1 billion demonstrates a basically budget system unable to operate at the speed and scale necessary given the rate of technological change and given the threat that the U.S. is under from Chinese military advances in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that we did some good things. We moved the ball forward. I'm proud of some of the things that we did, but there's a lot more work to be done.
So Ray Dalio had a quote today that America can't produce things, manufactured goods cost effectively. It's pretty clear to me the challenge of scaling up, very advanced missiles or F-35s or whatever. But Shashank, if Ukraine can figure out how to build 1.5 million drones a year, I'm pretty sure the U.S. could if we decided. I don't know. You tell me.
Well, look, let's unpack this a little bit, right? First of all, Ukraine is doing this under wartime conditions. It's ripping up rules, not all of them, but ripping up a lot of them. It doesn't have to worry about pesky things like health and safety standards. Like, hey, can I build this explosive warhead facility next to this town? You try doing that in the US or the UK or in Europe. The Ukrainians can get around that because you're at war. It's fine. Secondly, what are they building these things with? Okay, let's look into that. The Ukrainian supply chain for UAVs, for UASs, and for lots of other things, including electronic warfare systems, is still full of Chinese stuff. They haven't got it all out. Yes, there are companies beginning to find alternative supply chains and finding stuff from Taiwan and other countries, but the U.S. government can't do that, right? There's the little pesky matter of the NDAA, which prohibits you from just sticking Chinese components into all of your drones and building them out. So you have to get supply chains right. That's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is, to what standard are you building these things, right? Are you demanding that they can cope with this level of electronic warfare, radiation hardening, cybersecurity standards? Those are all the requirements that are being placed on UASs in many Western governments. I won't speak directly to the US exactly because Mike knows it better than I do, but certainly in my country, I'm aware of this. The Ukrainians can build things to a satisfactory standard that would never kind of stand up to the scrutiny of an accounting or auditing official in a Western country to the same way. And then the final point on all of this, I would say, is the level of mobilization for the defense industrial base is quite different, right? Ukraine has nationalized its IT sector. It had a brilliant IT sector before the war. It had some great technicians, tech-minded people, software-minded people. That is just not the case in most of our countries. We can't nationalize our tech industry to go work to build software-defined weapons at a low cost, very effectively and quickly. Those are some of the reasons I can see for the discrepancy. Mike, do you disagree? Are there others?
No, I think that is all correct. I think I'm probably more optimistic than you about the ability to build at low cost. Although, what exactly you define at low cost? I mean, like, what is attritable? Like, if we think about attritable as sort of like replaceable kinds of systems, what's attritable probably varies depending on like how wealthy you are and how big your defense budget is. So, like, what's attritable for the United States might be different than what is attritable for Ukraine. But I actually think that there's a lot of possibility to get lower cost systems. Like, one example is, last year there was a Air Force DIU solicitation for a low cost long range cruise missile that would be, about $150,000 to $300,000 a pop. And that's way more expensive than like an FPV drone in Ukraine, but that's a lot more capability than an FPV drone in Ukraine. And given that existing systems, some of those existing systems cost $1 million or more, if you can deliver that at, what is a fraction of the cost, you're then buying back a lot of mass, I think, in a useful way. The thing that I will be really interested to see, sort of shifting actually to Europe for a second, is if you look, and let me talk about the UK actually, if you look at what Task Force Kindred has done for Ukraine and some of the capabilities that have been scaled for Ukraine, my question is, when is the UK going to buy those for the UK? That, if these are militarily useful capabilities for fighting Russia on the battlefield in Europe, seems like something that might be useful for the United Kingdom's military. Or say the German company Helsing, when we were in Munich, Shashank, there was that announcement that they had produced 6,000 drones that were going to get sold to Ukraine. And obviously in the context of millions being produced, but presumably those 6,000 are pretty good from a quality perspective. Why isn't Germany buying those drones then?
Helsing's a really good example, Mike, because they are, you actually see the side-by-side comparison, right? In Ukraine, distributed in Ukrainian manufacturing facilities, they are building these UAVs that are, the hardware standardization is not completely standardized. The software has to kind of adapt for the different airframes being built by different producers. But they're good enough. They're doing a good job. They're making a difference. They're producing Lancet-like capability at considerably lower cost, as far as I understand it. But Helsing is also building drones for NATO countries in southern Germany in its own factories. The advantage is that it controls the supply chains. It can standardize the process. It can build software-defined weapons in ways where the hardware is optimized to take that on. In the way that Tesla once built other people's cars and put its code in them. But since that initial phase, it's built its own hardware because it's easier to build a software-defined car if you do it yourself. But it's going to be more expensive, and it's not going to be as cheap and quick and easy as the Ukrainian manufacturing. So I believe there are some trade-offs that you see even within the same company.
Absolutely. That also is why you need more open architecture all around, and why in some ways the government needs to own more of the IP. And that if you, think about what I said before about you have trucks and brains, essentially. If you're buying a truck that only can have a brain from the same company, then you're locked into a manufacturing relationship that's almost necessarily going to generate higher costs over time than if you can swap out the brain sort of over time with something that might be, more advanced. Frankly, whether it's lower cost or not, it's probably a better idea to be able to swap it out. But this reflects differences in not just the defense industrial base, but in how I think the U.S. and Western militaries have thought about requirements for capabilities over time.
Yeah.
in ways that I think now require challenge.
There was a really interesting speech. The chief of defense staff in the UK, the head of our armed forces, in this case, Admiral Sir Tony Ratikin, they give a speech every year at Christmas at the Royal United Services Institute, the think tank in London.
Is there port?
There is wine after the lecture, but we're not drinking port during the lecture. But
I'm imagining like brandy and cigars and port and like a wood-paneled room.
You're not far off on the room itself, right?
Are there oil portraits? Do we have like Hague and stuff?
There are oil portraits. I declare I'm on the advisory board at RUSI, so I have to declare I'm very fond of it. But anyway, I've gone down this rabbit hole. But the reason I did it is because I wanted to quote a line from that speech he gave at Christmas, where he said, "We have been able to demonstrate only pockets of innovation rather than the wholesale transformation. And we got those pockets right because we used an entirely different set of permissions, which elevated speed and embraced risk. We could help Ukraine. When we try to bring this into the mainstream, our system tends to suffocate the opportunities." So what he proposed, and this is really interesting, he said, I want a duality of systems whereby major projects and core capabilities are still delivered in a way that is fail-safe. Clearly the case for nuclear, for example. But an increasing proportion of projects, he writes, are delivered under a different system which is safe to fail. Mike, this is pretty much what you told me when we spoke as well a few weeks ago, right? A willingness to embrace failure, not for your kind of Ohio-class SSBNs or your bombers, but for your smaller systems where the cost of failure is not terrible and you need to fail to innovate. I think that is so much of what it's going to take for us to be able to be more Ukrainian in our own systems.
And let's contrast that with a quote on the U.S. side of the pond from Bill LaPlante, who was the DoD's top acquisition executive during the Biden administration. The tech bros are not helping us much. If somebody gives you a really cool liquored up story about a DIU or OTA, ask them when it's going into the production. Ask them how many numbers, ask them unit cost, all those questions, because that's what matters. Don't tell me it's got AI and quantum in it. I don't care.
I think Bill LaPlante thinks that it's still 1995. And I think the thing that was remarkable about that quote is even at the time, it was so profoundly incorrect in the way that it described the ability to scale emerging capabilities. In that, even looking at things that the U.S. was investing, I mean, the remarkable thing is, shortly before he left office, there was a speech, or maybe just around your question or something, where he said that he had learned from the Houthis and what they'd done in the Red Sea, that it was possible to produce low-cost munitions. Unclear why, what was happening in the U.S. had not, triggered that revelation, but he got there. I think that is the mindset that requires challenge, in that if you view the only things as worth using as an extremely small number of exquisite platforms, then that takes you down a road where emerging capabilities, even those you can scale, might sort of seem less useful because, again, they might require using force differently, like if you're operating at mass rather than just operating those exquisite capabilities. I think the bigger challenge, though, is every single major defense acquisition program in the U.S. military is either behind timeline, over budget, or both. And most are both. And what that suggests is that the current system, which is designed to buy down risk and, produce these great capabilities, and it does, but just slower than it's supposed to, with higher prices than it's supposed to, in a way that suggests that the current system is not succeeding. And I think actually risk is the right way to think about this, in that the scale and scope of the challenge posed by the Chinese military is unlike anything I have seen in my lifetime from an American perspective. And that means that sort of assumption that undergirded the 90s, frankly, about the inevitability of American conventional military superiority is just no longer the case. It's not just that we can't sit on our laurels, which is something that I think I wrote maybe like a decade and a half ago. It's that we are being actively pushed and challenged across almost all domains. And what that requires is then accepting more risk in the capability development process, which I feel comfortable doing, not only because I'm generally bullish on the ability of emerging technologies to deliver, but also because I think the status quo system just isn't working.
And I think the what we can't ignore then is what is stopping us, or you in the US case, from taking that risk. And often it's the politics, right? It's you talked about how Replicator to shift, what is it, 0.5% of the budget requires this Herculean bureaucratic political effort on the Hill to plead with senators and congressmen and congresspeople, please let me move this $15 million here and there. That's not sustainable if you're trying to make a systemic effect. You have to have appropriators who are willing to say, actually, I trust you with this money, and I trust you to be able to spend it in a way that's flexible and won't lock you into a spending path for the next 6 months without wasting it. And let's test you on that in 6 months' time, but not micromanaging everything. I don't know how you're gonna be allowed to have the failure that you need to have, the innovation you need, if Congress doesn't trust people to innovate at scale, not just in these little pockets of innovation, as Radikin called it.
I mean, in every single rule that the appropriations committees have, they have because of something that happened in the Department of Defense in the past. But to be clear, but we are in a different era now with a different set of risks and a China challenge, again, that's unlike anything we have faced before. And so I think we need a new bargain in some ways with the appropriations committee to be able to innovate at the speed and scale we need, particularly given, I mean, keep in mind, the Pentagon's budgeting process was invented by Robert McNamara, like Vietnam era Robert McNamara. It has not changed then. In the best of times, it is a 2-year cycle between when one of the military services decides it wants to invest in a technology and when it basically gets the money to invest in that technology. And we've spent several years of the last decade and a half in continuing resolutions, which means Congress can't pass and appropriate a budget, which means you can't start new programs, which then delays adopting new capabilities even further. So like something has to give there.
I want to recommend to everyone Program to Fail, The Rise of Central Planning and Defense Acquisition by Eric Lofgren, who's now working in the Senate, used to run acquisition talk and do shows with me about this stuff. It wasn't just McNamara. It was McNamara trying to learn from the Soviets.
Well, yeah, look, the assumption was we've got the technology we need. Like, we think that our basic tech development system works. What we need to be able to do is produce this stuff and produce good stuff, and then we'll beat the Soviets. And look, it worked. Yeah. But we're in a different period now.
There's an interesting book. I wrote a review essay on it for Foreign Affairs about a year ago by Edward Luttwak and Eitan Shamir, head of an Israeli think tank, called How Israel Fights. And I don't find all of it persuasive. But it just raises the question of how this country in the 1960s, this agrarian society that is poorer than many parts of Southern Europe in GDP per capita, produces these anti-ship missiles, for instance, that are able to defeat the Soviet weapons being carried by the Egyptians of that era and the Syrians. And I think it's super interesting to ask, what did they do right? What have they done right? There are many things that they've done wrong, and there are many cases in which tech innovation did not help them strategically or even contributed to complacency. But there's something about that innovation, including innovation under conditions of peacetime or semi-peacetime, that I think we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I have a 5-hour Ed Luttwak episode in the tank that I've been dreading editing, but we did get into it, and I think there is something, it comes back to some of the Ukraine stuff. Israel is a semi-mobilized society. It's playing at a smaller scale. There's this great anecdote where Luttwak walks into someone's office and says you should arrange the tank this way instead of that way, and then they do it because somebody thought it was a good idea. Whatever. You take all his stories with a grain of salt, but still, conceptually, the fact that this is all among friends in this small network of, oh, by the way, the best minds in the country.
Whereas in our system, 14 different people can say no and stop a capability, but no one person can say yes and move it forward.
And I think this is one of the many shames of the Trump imperial presidency is he has enough control of Congress to do this well. Look, and getting Pete Hegseth to be the one to lead it is just one of these unfortunate timelines that we're in because the president couldn't give two shits about this stuff. But maybe there's enough tech people around him there.
Let me muster a point of optimism here, frankly, on this. And, in the brilliant article that Shashank wrote in The Economist on some of these questions, I sounded a similar note. If you look at Hegseth's testimony his discussion of defense innovation is very coherent, and he makes points that are not structurally dissimilar to the ones that we have been making for whatever the last period of time has been. And if you look at Feinberg's testimony yesterday to be Deputy Secretary of Defense, he actually makes some very similar points. And you hear some of those, echoed by varieties of the tech sector folks that, look to be entering either the White House or the Defense Department. So I think there is a potential opportunity here for the Trump administration to push harder and faster on precise mass capabilities, on AI integration, on a bunch of and on, frankly, on acquisition reform in the defense sector, because the president right now seems to have a strong hand with regard to Congress. Whether the president's willing to use political capital for those purposes is not, clear. Like how the politics of that will play out is unclear. But if the Trump administration does all the things that it says it wants to do from a defense innovation perspective, that may not be a bad thing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that they want to do that are very consistent with things that a lot of us have advocated for over the years.
And I really admire, by the way, your kind of dispassionate assessment of that and your willingness to sort of think about it apart from the politics. But my concern is also that you have people who are good at radicalizing and disrupting many businesses and sectors and fields of life. But the skills that are required to do that are different to the skills in a bureaucracy like this, because just because you were able to navigate the car sector and the rocket sector doesn't mean you know how to cajole, persuade, and massage the ego of a know-nothing congressman from, I'm not going to name a state because that'll end up being rude, but who knows nothing about this and who simply cares that you build the attritable mass in his state, however stupid an idea that is, and who wants you to sign off on the $20 million. I worry that they will either break everything, and I'm afraid what I'm seeing Doge do right now with a level of recklessness and abandon is worrying to me as an ally of the United States, from a country that is an ally, but also that they will just not have the political nous to navigate these things, to make it happen. Just because Trump controls Congress and has sway over Congress doesn't mean that the pork barrel politics of this at the granular level fundamentally change. You need operatives, congressional, political operatives, and a tech bro may have many virtues and skills, but that isn't necessarily one of them.
No argument. I think that there's a huge gap between being willing to lean further forward on defense innovation and transformation and the ability to bureaucratize, essentially, as a friend of mine often is fond of saying, and be able to get the job done delivering. I mean, the Pentagon is the world's largest bureaucracy, and it will continue to be the world's largest bureaucracy, even with whatever is happening. And that requires a lot of bureaucratic political acumen to be able to deliver results. And it is, and I would say, a very open question whether this administration will be able to deliver on that. And frankly, there are early signs that are concerning, but again, it's still early days.
I want to reflect a little bit about the role of inside knowledge and outside knowledge when it comes to understanding sort of what's happening in Ukraine as well as the future of war. What does stuff like Shashank's reporting get? What can it not get? And, how does all of the open source analysis that's happening today about the war in Ukraine kind of filter into discussions about budgets in Congress and, R&D and future capabilities and whatnot?
Systematically drawing insights from open source material, both, Shashank's and others, in ways that inform what we do in the Defense Department. And actually, I think in the context of Ukraine lessons learned, there are actually a number of different efforts, both classified and unclassified, that try to dive into those things. And so I think in the case of Ukraine specifically, there's heroic effort, both inside and outside the context of like just the Ukraine desk, say, at the Pentagon or on the Joint Staff or something, to do that. I think the challenge sometimes is making some of those insights more visible, and then in connecting them to the change that you wish to see. And part of the issue is that folks are really busy, and folks are busy in ways that I think are sometimes even difficult to comprehend on the outside. And your read time, even to read, things that you really want to read, it's just extremely limited. And so the role of an influential columnist like Shashank that lots of people trust is then invaluable, because for a lot of senior folks, that might be the only outside thing they read about defense in a given week. And so, what that also then points to is the importance of networks then. I think about this a lot from the perspective of like, how should academics, like how to bridge the gap basically between academic research and policy. And like networks play a huge role there. But in the case of Ukraine, I think there actually has been really good pickup inside, at least in the US, on what lessons learned look like because of a lot of the great reporting out there. Sometimes then people would say like, oh, but we haven't seen you do this and you haven't seen you do that. Like, why haven't you then purchased like this drone that Ukraine has and like uses? But it's a great question. It's just really challenging to consume all of the information out there that you should consume. And so a lot of it ends up getting mediated through staffs, et cetera.
Here's a deep cut for you guys. So Ian Hamilton, who like ran the Gallipoli campaign, he was like a journalist. He covered the war in Manchuria between Imperial Russia and the Japanese, and like saw the future of war and wrote about it really clearly. But like, even though this guy was there and then he was like on the battlefield running it in Turkey, was not able to sort of like instantiate the lessons that he saw firsthand into the way he ended up, killing a few 100,000 people probably who didn't need to die if he made smarter decisions. So I don't know. None of this shit is easy.
As part of like research for a future book, I was at the National Archives in College Park last week looking for information on a U.S. Military procurement decisions in the early 20th century surrounding general purpose technologies, and found some really interesting back and forth between the War Department and the Wright brothers about the airplane. That sounded a lot like the Wright brothers are like, well, send us the cash and we'll send you the airplane. And the War Department's like, prove it works and like meets these metrics, and like, then we'll pay you and then you deliver the airplane. Like it was like a lot, like it's like, oh dear God, like maybe nothing has changed in some ways in some of these debates.
Shashank, any reflections on like the role of popular writing and all this stuff?
I'm amazed by the cut through we can sometimes get, right? People will say, I can't take my classified system on a plane to read, but I can take a copy of The Economist. So you suddenly have this responsibility. And I've had these deep experts on something like, let's say armored warfare and tanks will say, like, I've been screaming this message into the ether for years, but it was only when you quoted me on this that, like, this general read me. And so we're sometimes in the strange position of being, I don't want to say conduits, because of course we would never wish to be thought of as uncritical conduits for anything, but ways that can short circuit these networks and can cut across them in strange and amusing ways. And in which I have the grave responsibility of being able to not only tell my readers about the big stuff, like, hey, what's Trump going to do next? Where's Ukraine headed? But like, if this is not too condescending, like feed them their vegetables, like make them think about Mike's essay on precise mass and be like, have you thought about this specific wonky thing? And maybe I have to bury it in a piece that's about the future of drones, but I can make them think or about budgeting, right? Mike tells me, hey, you have to understand budgets to understand innovation. And then I think, okay, now there's a challenge. My editors may not like me talking about budgets for a page, but hey, this is my job, to get it across and to make people read it and listen to it. And I'm fortunate that I have access to the expertise like that of Mike and others to be able to translate that into a generic function. Fundamentally, Jordan, I see my job as not giving people the answers. It's just giving them a sense of the debates that the knowledgeable people are having. That's not to say one person's right, one person's wrong, but to say, here's the lay of the land, here's the arguments on each side, here are the debates, and give them a flavor. Let them peer through that window into the world of the conversation that Mike may be having with his colleague on what they disagree on.
Yeah, and I think sort of what you do, what Mike Kaufman does, what Mick Ryan does, what Mike Lee can do, which I imagine would be harder if you are sitting on the Ukraine desk and your job is to cover what's happening in electronic warfare, is to think about this all synthetically and across the different domains. And in your case, Shashank's, even across regions, where, and this is what I feel like I do at some sense with China Talk as well, is like, I guess, Shashank, you kind of have an editor who it seems like you can just bowl through at this point. But I'm very glad you can basically bowl through at this point and write budget articles about. But like picking what it is you want your readers to read and think about is like the game, right? and doing that in a really thoughtful way when there is so much new that's happening. And there are so many battles that are happening in every moment. And there are so many little tactical sort of innovations and counter responses and what have you, I think is essential, particularly when for the public at large and also for the senior leaders who only, God forbid, the president who only has like 3% of his time to really sit down and absorb this stuff.
Or the vice president who has lots of it.
Mike, continuing on why outside writing matters.
Sure. So now that I've left the government again, when I think about how, as an outsider, as an academic, how to try to influence policy, one way to think about this is if you want the U.S. government and the national security arena to be doing something and they're not doing it, there's usually one of two reasons. First, you might be wrong. There could be, classified information, some other information you do not have access to that just shows that you're wrong. Second, you're right, but your bureaucratic allies are losing. Since it is hubris, given the size of the national security agencies, including the Pentagon, to think that, you have some idea that literally nobody in the entirety of the Pentagon and the intelligence community and the State Department, et cetera, that literally nobody has that idea. Generally, somebody wants the same thing that you want, but they're losing. And so the question is, how do you give them ammunition to help make the case to move that policy forward? And, in the kind of writing that involves, advocating for policies or making arguments for policies, now I think it makes sense to think about this in terms of how are you providing support to your bureaucratic allies, even if you don't know who they are and even if they don't know you until they see something you write, show up in the early bird in the morning at the Defense Department or through some sort of press clippings. That's how I think about the role of outside writing in how you can try to influence policy.
Yeah, it's always weird for me when I write something in China Talk and get an email from someone I've never met being like, thanks for this. This was helpful. Just putting your arguments with some good thoughtful analysis out into the ether. Sometimes works in mysterious ways.
Right. Well, because I think that there's this fiction that you write an op-ed and it somehow ends up on the desk of the president. And then all of a sudden U.S. foreign policy changes. That's just not how the real world generally works. Especially if what you're trying to influence is policy within a bureaucracy. And so I'm encouraged to hear people within the government should be listening to China Talk and getting insights from it. That's terrific, and I think that's evidence for this idea that you have allies, and you're trying to help give them ammunition to make the case in whatever fora they're engaged in.
I got one last question for you guys, if you don't mind. All of this compared to reading and writing and doing podcasts about the PLA itself is just so much more interesting because I've read a lot of PLA books and I've really thought about doing more shows about it, but it's so difficult to talk in hypotheticals and you're reading these doctrine stuff and you're doing the OSINT and whatever. And it's just it's so hard to actually learn things and talk about them in an interesting way. So I'm curious if you guys have any advice for me about what better PLA coverage in outlets like China Talk or just more broadly could look like to get people thinking more seriously about all this stuff.
I think it's super hard. I mean, I think about this a lot actually in the context of PhD students and junior faculty and what the academic China watching community is doing in this space, and especially given the way that Xi has consolidated control in China, there's still a lot available, but there's so much less available, frankly, than there was, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And that then creates, analytical challenges because what you can get, then there are questions well, why could I get this? And are there essentially to be really nerdy, selection effects that govern what you're able to access. And the truth is there's no military in the world where we probably have a greater uncertainty parameter about its potential performance in a conflict than China's military, than the PLA. because it's just been decades since it fought. And like, we know what weapons we have. We know what their doctrine says. The ability to put all that together, as we know from the Russia-Ukraine context, or like any war in history, is like very different than what it looks like on paper. And so I do not envy the task. And I think all you can do in some ways is acknowledge that endemic, or that irreducible uncertainty, I think is probably the right way to say that. Acknowledge that irreducible uncertainty and do your best to like give folks the information that is available.
I would just add to that, let's learn from our analytical errors in the past and think about how they might apply. I've really enjoyed some of the writing done by people like Sam Bresnik at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown on the way the PLA thinks about AI. And he doesn't say, they're miles behind, that's useless. But he does give a flavor of Chinese debate, saying they worry about many of the same things that we do. They worry about, explainability, about control, command oversight. They even worry about ethics. That's not completely absent. And they've got issues around, compute capacity and all these other things. So it's just helpful to be reminded that what they say on the page about intelligentized warfare and this and that, there's grappling with some of the same challenges that we all are. And I admire the work of people like Sam and others and his colleagues and many others who think about these from a very fieldwork-based or empirical perspective, getting their hands dirty, reading the stuff, talking to people, looking through journals. That's great work.
Well, as Sam's peer advisor in high school when I was a senior and he was a sophomore, I am going to take complete credit for all the brilliant work that he's done, both in Beijing and now in Washington. All right, last thing. Each of you, give one book for everyone to read.
My junior colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Fiona Cunningham, I think is the most talented academic scholar of the Chinese military of her generation. And she has a book that just came out with Princeton University Press titled Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security. And so I would highly recommend checking out Fiona's book.
The orthodox choice is someone who came up earlier, Paul Shari's book, Army of None, which I still think is fantastic on the issue of autonomous weapons, brilliant on the history, and thinks about it historically. Fantastic book for anyone still thinking about autonomous weapons. But the slightly left field choice I do want to put out there is Billion Dollar Spy by David Hoffman, which is a story of one of the CIA's most difficult operations in Moscow, running Adolf Tolkashov, a Soviet engineer. And the reason it's relevant to this conversation is it's about the application of technology to operations, in this case, intelligence operations, running an agent in Moscow, communications technology, miniaturization, the way that the emerging plastics industry and transistor industry affects the CIA's choices in the 50s, the way that changes with satellites. And I love the idea of thinking about this in a completely different field, intelligence espionage, and the parallels and ideas that may spark for us thinking about the defense world.
Amazing. Oh my God, this is such a great show. We're going to have you two back together. Thank you two so much for being a part of China Talk.